The desert wind carried stories across the vast expanse of New Mexico, whispering secrets through the sagebrush and juniper trees that dotted the landscape like ancient sentinels. It was the kind of morning where the sky stretched endlessly in every direction, painted in soft pastels of dawn that would soon give way to the relentless heat of summer. The year was 1892, and the frontier still held its breath between civilization and wilderness, between hope and hardship. Thomas Bennett had always been an early riser, but today something pulled him from sleep even before the rooster's first crow. At 32, he carried himself with the weathered confidence of a man who had learned to read the land's moods like pages in a well-worn book. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. His calloused hands spoke of years spent working cattle, mending fences and coaxing life from stubborn soil. The Bennett ranch stretched for miles in every direction, a testament to his grandfather's vision and his own relentless determination to honor that legacy. He stepped onto the wooden porch of the modest farmhouse, his boots making soft sounds against the aged plank. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of wild grass and the distant promise of rain. His border collie, Duke, lifted his graying muzzle from where he lay curled near the door, amber eyes alert and questioning. The dog had been his constant companion for 8 years, through drought and plenty, through the loneliness that sometimes crept in during the long winter nights. Something felt different about this morning, though Thomas couldn't quite place what it was. The cattle were restless in the distance, their lowing carrying on the breeze with an urgency he'd learned to recognize. Duke's ears pricked forward, head tilting as he caught some sound or scent that Thomas's human senses had missed. The dog rose slowly, stretching his lean frame before padding down the porch steps with the careful gait of age mixed with purpose. Thomas followed his faithful companion across the yard, past the chicken coop where his hens were just beginning to stir, past the vegetable garden his late mother had planted 20 years ago, and which he still tended with religious devotion. The ranch had been in his family for 3 generations, carved from the wilderness by men and women who understood that survival meant community, that kindness was not weakness but the very foundation of civilization in an untamed land. The old wagon road that cut through his property had seen countless travelers over the years, settlers heading west toward California's promise of gold and opportunity, families fleeing hardship in search of something better, peddlers and preachers and all manner of folk seeking their fortunes or their salvation in the vast American. Thomas had always felt a responsibility to those who passed through his land, offering water to the thirsty, directions to the lost, and sometimes a hot meal to those who looked like they needed it most. Duke's urgent bark drew his attention toward the far side of the property, where an old oak tree provided shade for weary travelers. Its massive trunk had weathered decades of storms, its branches spreading wide like protective arms over anyone who sought shelter beneath them. Many had rested there over the years, some leaving carved initials in the bark as proof of their passage, others simply taking what comfort they could before continuing their journey toward whatever destiny awaited them. But this morning, beneath the familiar oak sat something that made Thomas quicken his pace. An old wagon, weathered and road-worn, with canvas sides that had seen better days. The oxen that had pulled it were nowhere to be seen, and the wagon sat at an odd angle, as if it had been abandoned in haste or exhaustion. One wheel appeared damaged, and the entire conveyance had the look of something that had traveled far too many miles with far too heavy a burden. As Thomas drew closer, Duke's excitement became more pronounced. The dog's tail wagged tentatively, but his body language spoke of caution mixed with curiosity. There was something alive in that wagon, something that deserved careful approach. Thomas had learned to trust his dog's instincts over the years, and Duke's careful alertness told him that whatever lay beneath that canvas was worth both attention and respect. The morning sun was climbing higher now, casting longer shadows and bringing warmth to the cool desert air. Thomas could hear sounds from within the wagon, soft sounds that spoke of life and movement. He approached slowly, his boots making deliberate sounds on the hard-packed earth so that whoever was inside would know of his presence. The last thing he wanted was to startle someone who might already be frightened or vulnerable. When he reached the wagon's tailgate, Thomas cleared his throat softly and called out in his most gentle voice. The sounds from within ceased immediately, replaced by a silence so complete it seemed to hold its own weight. He waited, understanding that patience was often the key to earning trust, especially with strangers who might have reason to fear unexpected encounters. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only moments, a soft rustling came from within the wagon. The canvas flap moved slightly, and Thomas caught a glimpse of movement in the shadowy interior. He took a step back, giving whoever was inside space to emerge at their own pace, his hands visible and empty to show he meant no harm. What appeared first was a head of golden hair, tangled and dusty from the road but catching the morning light like spun silk. The woman who emerged from the wagon moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to be cautious about revealing herself to strangers. Her dress was simple but well made, though now showing the wear of long travel and hard living. She appeared to be in her early 20s, with eyes the color of summer sky that held both intelligence and a weariness that spoke of difficult experiences. But it was what she carried that truly caught Thomas's attention and held. Cradled in her arms was a baby, perhaps 6 months old, with the same golden hair as the woman and a face that spoke of peaceful sleep despite the circumstances. The child was wrapped in a faded quilt that had clearly been crafted with love, each stitch speaking of someone's hope for warmth and comfort. And perched on the woman's shoulder, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, sat a red hen. The bird's bright eyes surveyed Thomas with the kind of intelligence that farm folk knew to respect in their feathered companions. Her feathers were rust-colored and sleek, and she sat with the dignity of a creature who knew her own worth and expected others to recognize it as well. The woman's eyes met Thomas's, and he saw in them a mixture of defiance and desperation that he recognized from his own difficult times. She lifted her chin slightly, as if preparing for judgment or rejection, but her grip on the baby tightened protective. The hen on her shoulder clucked softly, a sound that seemed to offer comfort and support. "Morning, miss," Thomas said quietly, removing his hat in a gesture of respect. "I'm Thomas Bennett. This is my land you're resting on." He kept his voice gentle and his movements slow, the same approach he used with spooked horses or frightened cattle. Duke sat at his side, still alert but relaxed enough to show that his master felt no threat from these unexpected visitors. The woman swallowed hard before speaking, her voice carrying the traces of education despite the obvious hardship she had endured. "I apologize for trespassing, Mr. Bennett. We only stopped to rest for the night. We'll be moving on direct." Her words were polite but guarded, the response of someone who had learned to expect rejection or worse from strangers. Thomas noticed the way she said "we," including the baby and even the hen in her consideration. There was something touching about that inclusion, something that spoke to the kind of person she was beneath the weariness and the road-worn appearance. The baby stirred in her arms, making soft sounds that any parent would recognize as the prelude to waking hunger. "No need to apologize," Thomas replied, his tone warm but not intrusive. "That tree's been sheltering travelers for longer than I've been alive. You're welcome to whatever comfort it provides." He gestured toward the oak's spreading branches, where morning light filtered through the leaves in patterns of gold and green. The hen on the woman's shoulder made a soft sound, almost like a commentary on the conversation. Thomas found himself looking directly at the bird, which regarded him with bright, intelligent eyes. There was something almost dignified about the creature, something that suggested she was more than just a traveling companion. "That's quite a friend you have there," Thomas observed, nodding toward the hen. The woman's expression softened slightly, the first crack in her careful guard. "This is Henrietta," she said, and for the first time Thomas caught a glimpse of warmth in her voice. "She's been with us," she paused as if deciding how much to reveal, "since we left Kansas." The woman's hand moved to gently stroke the hen's feathers, a gesture so natural it spoke of long companionship. Thomas nodded, understanding that there was a story behind that simple statement, probably a difficult one. In his experience, people didn't leave Kansas with nothing but a baby and a hen, unless circumstances had left them little choice. But he also understood that stories were earned, not demanded, and that trust was something that grew slowly between strangers. The baby began to fuss more insistently, and the woman shifted her weight as if preparing to climb back into the wagon to tend to the child's need. Thomas could see the exhaustion in her movements, the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from too many days of uncertainty and too many nights of insufficient rest. "Begging your pardon, miss," Thomas said carefully, "but you and your little one look like you could use a proper meal and maybe a chance to rest somewhere more comfortable than a wagon bed." He gestured toward his house, where smoke was beginning to rise from the chimney as his housekeeper, Miss Martinez, started the morning fire. The woman's eyes followed his gesture, and he could see the longing there quickly suppressed, but not before he caught a glimpse of just how much she wanted what he was offering. But weariness won out, as he had expected it might. "That's very kind, Miss Bennett, but we couldn't impose. We don't have money to pay for food or lodging." Her chin lifted again with that mixture of pride and desperation that Thomas was beginning to recognize as characteristic. Thomas found himself smiling, the kind of smile that had reassured nervous animals and worried neighbors for most of his adult life. Well, now that might not be a problem. His eyes moved meaningfully to Henrietta, who seemed to puff up slightly as if she knew she was being discussed. The woman followed his gaze and frowned slightly. I don't understand. My hens have been laying poorly lately, Thomas explained, which was true enough. Old age, I suspect, or maybe just stubbornness. Now if that fine bird of yours were to contribute an egg or two to breakfast, I'd say that more than covers the cost of a meal and a safe place to rest. He watched the woman's face as understanding dawned, saw the way her expression shifted from confusion to surprise to something that might have been hope. Henrietta, as if she understood the conversation, ruffled her feathers and made a soft clucking sound that could have been agreement. You're suggesting that Henrietta earn our keep? The woman asked, and Thomas caught something in her voice that sounded like the beginning of relief. I'm suggesting that good neighbors help each other out, Thomas replied. You've got something I need, and I've got something you need. Seems like a fair trade to me. He paused, letting the offer settle between them. The question is, does she lay well enough to earn breakfast for 3? The woman looked down at Henrietta, who seemed to regard her with bright, knowing eyes. She's the best layer in 3 counties, she said with the first genuine pride Thomas had heard in her voice. At least she was back in Kansas. Then I'd say we have ourselves an arrangement, Thomas said, extending his hand toward the wagon. If you'll allow me to help you down, we can get you and the little one settled somewhere more comfortable, and Henrietta can show my lazy hens how proper laying is done. The woman hesitated for a long moment, studying Thomas's face as if trying to read his intention. Duke, sensing the importance of the moment, moved closer to his master and sat with the kind of patient dignity that seemed to vouch for Thomas's character. The morning breeze stirred the leaves of the oak tree above them, creating patterns of light and shadow that seemed to dance around the small group. Finally the woman nodded, a gesture so small it was almost imperceptible but which Thomas recognized as a momentous decision. My name is Elizabeth Walsh, she said quietly. This is my daughter Rose. She shifted the baby so that Thomas could see the child's face, peaceful in sleep despite the morning's commotion. Elizabeth, Thomas repeated, tasting the name and finding it fitting. It's a pleasure to meet you, Miss Walsh, and you too, Miss Rose. He stepped forward to offer his assistance, moving slowly and carefully to avoid startling either mother or child. Elizabeth handed Rose to him first, a gesture of trust that he didn't take lightly. The baby was warm and soft in his arms, smelling of milk and that indefinable sweetness that seemed to surround all young children. Rose stirred slightly but didn't wake, her tiny fist curling around Thomas's finger with surprising strength. With her hands free, Elizabeth was able to climb down from the wagon more easily, though Thomas could see the stiffness in her movements that spoke of too many nights sleeping on hard surfaces. Henrietta rode on her shoulder throughout the process, balancing with the ease of long practice and surveying her new surroundings with obvious interest. Your daughter is beautiful, Thomas said softly, reluctant to hand the sleeping child back but understanding that mothers and babies belong together. Elizabeth's face transformed when she looked at Rose, the weariness falling away to reveal a love so fierce and protective it was almost tangible. She's everything to me, Elizabeth said simply, and Thomas heard in those words the kind of truth that needed no elaboration. Whatever had brought this woman and her child to his land, whatever circumstances had reduced their possessions to what could fit in a broken wagon, that baby was the center of Elizabeth's world. Thomas led them toward the house, Duke trotting alongside with the pleased air of a dog who approved of new arrival. The ranch buildings were modest but well maintained, speaking of a man who took pride in his property and understood that attention to detail was what separated success from failure in frontier life. The main house was built of adobe and timber, designed to stay cool in summer and warm in winter, with a wide porch that offered shelter from both sun and storm. Mrs. Martinez appeared in the doorway as they approached, her kind face creased in curiosity and welcome. She had been keeping house for Thomas since his mother's death 5 years earlier, and her maternal instincts were immediately engaged by the sight of a woman with a baby. She began speaking rapidly in Spanish, her words clearly expressing concern and hospitality even to those who didn't understand the language. Miss Martinez says you're welcome and that she'll have breakfast ready shortly, Thomas translated, though Elizabeth seemed to understand the gist of the older woman's greeting. She also wants to know if the baby needs anything special. Elizabeth looked overwhelmed by the kindness, her eyes bright with what might have been unshed tears. Just some warm milk, if you have it, she managed. Rose will be hungry when she wakes. Miss Martinez nodded vigorously and bustled back into the house, clearly delighted to have someone to fuss over. Thomas gestured toward a comfortable chair on the porch, positioned to catch the morning breeze while remaining in the shade. Please, sit and rest, he urged. You look like you've been traveling hard. Elizabeth sank into the chair with obvious relief, Rose still sleeping peacefully in her arms. Henrietta,
freed from her perch on Elizabeth's shoulder, began exploring the porch with the curious dignity of a creature making herself at home. Thomas found himself studying Elizabeth more closely now that she was settled and seemed less likely to bolt at any moment. Her face showed the effects of worry and hard travel, but beneath the exhaustion he could see both intelligence and determination. Her hands, though obviously unused to rough work, showed the calluses and small cuts that came from learning to do whatever was necessary to survive. "How long have you been on the road?" he asked gently, settling into another chair where he could keep watch over both his guests and his land. Duke positioned himself between them, close enough to respond to any need but not intrusive enough to make Elizabeth uncomfortable. Elizabeth was quiet for so long that Thomas began to think she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft and distant, as if she were seeing something far beyond the peaceful ranch morning. 6 weeks, she said. Maybe 7. The days start to run together after a while. She looked down at Rose, who was beginning to stir in her arms. "We left Kansas in early May. I thought we'd be in California by now, but..." She gestured helplessly toward the broken wagon. Thomas nodded, understanding without need for further explanation. The trail west was littered with the dreams of people who had underestimated the challenges or overestimated their resources. For every family that made it to their destination, there were others who found themselves stranded somewhere in between, forced to adapt or perish. "California's still there," he said mildly. "It'll wait for you if you decide that's still where you want to go." He paused, watching Henrietta investigate a loose board on the porch with professional interest. "Course, New Mexico's got its own attraction. Some folks find they like it well enough to stay." Elizabeth's eyes met his, and he saw her trying to read the meaning behind his casual word. Before she could respond, Rose woke with the sudden completeness that was characteristic of babies, going from deep sleep to full alertness in the space of a heartbeat.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Her cry was lusty and demanding. Speaking of healthy lungs and an empty stomach, Mrs. Martinez appeared as if summoned by the sound, carrying a cup of warm milk and wearing the satisfied expression of a woman who had anticipated the need. She cooed softly to Rose in Spanish, her maternal instincts clearly engaged by the sight of a hungry baby. As Elizabeth tended to her daughter, Thomas found his attention drawn to Henrietta, who had completed her inspection of the porch and was now eyeing the area around the house with obvious interest. The hen moved with purpose, head cocked as if listening for something only she could hear. "I think your friend might be looking for a suitable nesting spot," Thomas observed. Elizabeth looked up from Rose, following his gaze to where Henrietta was investigating a wooden crate that sat near the kitchen door. "She's very particular about where she lays," Elizabeth said with a small smile, the first genuinely relaxed expression Thomas had seen from her. Back home she had a favorite nesting box that no other hen was allowed to use. She'd chase off birds twice her size to protect it. As if she had heard and understood the conversation, Henrietta made a soft sound and settled into the crate with obvious satisfaction. Her behavior changed subtly, taking on the focused concentration that any farm person would recognize as the prelude to egg laying. Thomas grinned, delighted by the hen's obvious intention to fulfill her part of their bargain. "Well, I'll be. She really is going to earn breakfast for all of you." Elizabeth watched Henrietta with obvious affection and not a little pride. "She's never let me down yet," she said softly. Even when everything else was falling apart, Henrietta kept laying. Some days her eggs were the only thing standing between Rose and hunger. The simple statement carried enormous weight, revealing more about Elizabeth's recent circumstances than hours of explanation might have done. Thomas felt a surge of admiration for this young woman who had clearly endured more than anyone should have to face, yet had somehow maintained her dignity and her devotion to her child. Miss Martinez bustled out of the house again, this time carrying a tray laden with the kind of breakfast that spoke of genuine hospitality. Fresh bread, butter churned that morning, jam made from wild berries, and eggs cooked exactly the way Thomas preferred them. The smell alone was enough to make anyone's mouth water, but Thomas could see it affecting Elizabeth in a way that went beyond simple hunger. "When did you last have a proper meal?" he asked gently, noting the way her eyes fixed on the food with an intensity that spoke of real need. Elizabeth flushed slightly, embarrassed by her obvious hunger. "A few days ago," she admitted. "We had some hardtack and jerky, but Rose needed the milk more than I needed the food." It was the kind of sacrifice that mothers made without thinking, but it told Thomas everything he needed to know about Elizabeth's priorities and her character. "Well then," he said, rising from his chair and moving the small table closer to Elizabeth so she could eat while still holding Rose. "I'd say Henrietta's timing is perfect. A fresh egg for breakfast, and the promise of more to come. As if summoned by the mention of her name, Henrietta emerged from the crate with obvious satisfaction and pride. She announced her accomplishment with a series of soft clucks that seemed to say she had upheld her end of the bargain and expected others to do the same. Thomas retrieved the warm egg from the crate, holding it up to catch the morning light. It was perfect, brown and smooth and still warm from the laying. Now that, he said with genuine appreciation, is what I call a proper egg. Elizabeth's face glowed with pride at the praise for her feathered companion. She's always been exceptional, she said, then caught herself as if realizing how silly it might sound to speak so seriously about a chicken. But Thomas's nod of understanding told her that he didn't find it silly at all. Good livestock is nothing to take lightly, he assured her. A hen that lays consistently is worth her weight in gold, especially out here where fresh food can be hard to come by. He paused, cracking the egg into a pan that Mrs. Martinez had ready. Seems to me like Henrietta's more than earned her keep already. The egg sizzled in the pan, filling the morning air with the rich aroma of cooking food. Thomas found himself watching Elizabeth's face as she took in the smell, saw the way her shoulders relaxed slightly, as if some tension she'd been carrying was finally beginning to ease. Miss Bennett, Elizabeth said quietly, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty, about your offer. How long would you expect us to stay? I mean, how many eggs would Henrietta need to lay to— She trailed off, clearly struggling with the practical details of their arrangement. Thomas considered the question seriously, understanding that she needed concrete terms to feel secure in accepting his help. Well, he said thoughtfully, seems to me like a good laying hen produces about 4 or 5 eggs a week. At that rate, I'd say a week's worth of eggs would more than cover room and board for you and Rose. He saw Elizabeth doing quick calculations in her head, probably trying to figure out how long she could afford to stay before needing to move on. The broken wagon wheel would need repair, and that would take time and money she probably didn't have. Of course, Thomas continued casually, if Henrietta wanted to stay longer and keep my lazy hens company, I wouldn't object. Sometimes older hens learn better habits when they have a good example to follow. He gestured toward his chicken coop, where several hens were scratching lazily in the dirt, looking decidedly less industrious than Henrietta. Elizabeth followed his gaze, then looked back at Thomas with an expression that was hard to read. You're very kind, Mr. Bennett, but I should be honest with you, we don't have much money for wagon repairs, and without that, she shrugged helplessly. One problem at a time, Thomas said gently. First, you eat a proper breakfast and get some rest, then we'll take a look at that wagon and see what needs doing. He paused, meeting her eyes directly. I've got some skill with woodwork, and my neighbor Jake Henderson is the best wheelwright in 3 counties. Between us we might be able to get you back on the road without it costing more than you can afford. The kindness in his offer seemed to overwhelm Elizabeth. She looked down at Rose, who was now awake and alert, taking in her new surroundings with the wide-eyed curiosity of infancy. When Elizabeth looked back up at Thomas, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. Why? She asked simply. Why would you help strangers like that? Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering how to answer a question that touched on the fundamental principles by which he tried to live his life. Duke, sensing the importance of the moment, rose from his place and padded over to rest his graying muzzle on Thomas's knee. My grandfather used to say that we're all just strangers until someone decides to be neighborly, Thomas finally replied. This land has been good to my family for 3 generations. Seems only right to pass some of that goodness along when I can. He scratched Duke behind the ears, the familiar gesture helping him find the words for feelings that weren't always easy to express. Besides, he added with a slight smile, Henrietta's already proven she's worth knowing, and anyone who can keep a hen laying consistently while traveling across the country in a broken wagon is probably someone worth helping. Elizabeth laughed softly at that, the sound like water over stones after the tension of their earlier conversation. Even Rose seemed to respond to her mother's lighter mood, making soft baby sounds that could have been laughter. Mrs. Martinez appeared with the cooked egg, perfectly prepared and still steaming hot. She set it before Elizabeth with obvious satisfaction, along with fresh bread and a cup of coffee that smelled like heaven itself. The older woman said something in rapid Spanish, gesturing toward Elizabeth and Rose with obvious approval. She says you have a beautiful daughter and that any mother who travels so far to protect her child deserves all the help we can give. Thomas translated. Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears at the unexpected kindness, and she reached out to clasp Mrs. Martinez's weathered hand in gratitude. As Elizabeth ate her first proper meal in days, Thomas found himself studying the interplay between mother and child. Rose was clearly healthy and well cared for, despite their difficult circumstances, which spoke volumes about Elizabeth's priorities and capability.
The baby's clothes were clean and well mended, and she responded to her mother's voice and touch with the secure contentment of a child who had never doubted her place in the world. Henrietta, having fulfilled her morning obligations, began exploring the ranch yard with obvious interest. She moved with the confident curiosity of a creature who expected to find interesting things in new places, and Thomas was amused to see his own hens watching her with what looked like respectful attention. "She's making quite an impression on the local ladies," he observed, nodding toward his chicken coop, where several hens had gathered at the fence to get a better look at the newcomer. Elizabeth smiled around a mouthful of fresh bread. "She's always been social. Back in Kansas she ruled the roost even though she wasn't the biggest hen. The others just seemed to accept that she knew what she was doing." "Leadership comes in all sizes," Thomas agreed. "Sounds like she chose her human companion well too. Takes courage to leave everything behind and strike out for unknown territory." The compliment made Elizabeth color slightly, but she didn't deny it. "Sometimes courage is just fear with nowhere else to go," she said quietly. "When staying becomes more dangerous than leaving, the choice makes itself." The words carried a weight that suggested there was much more to Elizabeth's story than simple wanderlust or the search for better opportunity. Thomas heard the pain beneath the practical statement, but he also heard the strength that had carried her this far from whatever she was fleeing. Rose began to fuss again, the cranky sounds of a baby who was fed but tired and overwhelmed by new surroundings. Elizabeth automatically began the gentle rocking motion that mothers learned by instinct, murmuring soft words of comfort. "She's had her routine disrupted for weeks now," Elizabeth explained apologetically. "Usually she's a very good baby, but all this travel—" She gestured helplessly at the obvious exhaustion that marked both mother and child. "What she needs is a quiet place to nap," Thomas said, rising from his chair. "And what you need is the same thing. Mrs. Martinez has a room ready for you, with a proper bed and everything." Elizabeth looked, torn between gratitude and the kind of weariness that came from having learned not to trust too easily. "Mr. Bennett, I appreciate your kindness, but I don't want to impose. If we could just rest here on the porch for a while." "Miss Walsh," Thomas interrupted gently, "when's the last time you slept in a real bed? And I mean slept, not just closed your eyes while listening for trouble." The question seemed to hit Elizabeth like a physical blow. She looked down at Rose, then back at Thomas, and he could see her careful defenses crumbling under the weight of exhaustion and the simple human need for safety and rest. "I don't remember," she whispered, and the admission seemed to take all her remaining strength. Thomas nodded, understanding more than she probably realized. "Then come on, let's get you both settled somewhere comfortable." He gestured toward the house, where Mrs. Martinez waited with obvious approval and anticipation. As they moved toward the door, Thomas caught sight of Henrietta, making herself at home near his chicken coop. The red hen had found a patch of dirt, perfect for dust bathing, and was settling in with obvious satisfaction. Several of his own hens watched with interest, as if learning proper dust bathing technique from an expert. "Looks like Henrietta's planning to stay a while," Thomas observed with amusement. Elizabeth followed his gaze and smiled. "She always was good at making herself at home. Maybe that's what I should learn from her." The words were spoken lightly, but Thomas heard the deeper meaning beneath them. The idea of making herself at home anywhere probably seemed impossible to Elizabeth right now, but he could see the longing in her eyes as she looked at his comfortable ranch house with its promise of safety and rest. Miss Martinez led them to a small but comfortable room at the back of the house, furnished with a simple bed covered in clean quilts, a washstand with fresh water, and a window that looked out over the ranch's peaceful landscape. The room smelled of lavender and sunshine, the scent of linens dried on outdoor lines and stored with careful attention to comfort. "This is beautiful," Elizabeth breathed, setting Rose down on the bed and watching as the baby immediately relaxed into the soft quilt. "Are you sure we're not putting you out? This room hasn't been used in years," Thomas assured her. "It's good to see it serving its purpose again." He paused in the doorway, understanding that she needed privacy to rest properly. "Sleep as long as you need to. We'll keep an eye on things out here." As he closed the door behind him, Thomas heard Elizabeth's soft voice murmuring to Rose, probably the first completely relaxed sounds either of them had made in weeks. He found Miss Martinez waiting in the kitchen, her face glowing with the satisfaction of a woman who had been able to offer genuine help to someone who needed it. "She is running from something," Mrs. Martinez said in her careful English. "That one. She has the look of someone who has seen too much trouble for one so young." Thomas nodded, having come to the same conclusion. "Whatever she's running from, she's safe here," he said firmly. "And that baby needs its mother to rest and recover." Mrs. Martinez smiled approvingly. "You are a good man, Thomas Bennett. Your mother, she would be proud." The simple statement carried more weight than elaborate praise, and Thomas felt the truth of it settle into his bones. Outside, he could see Henrietta continuing her exploration of the ranch, moving with the confident curiosity of a creature who had found something worth investigating. His own hens had abandoned their usual lazy scratching to follow her around the yard, as if hoping to learn something useful from their visitor. Duke appeared at his side, tail wagging slowly as he looked toward the house where their guests were hopefully finding rest. The old dog had always been a good judge of character, and his calm acceptance of Elizabeth and Rose spoke well for their intentions. "What do you think, old friend?" Thomas asked, scratching behind Duke's ears. "Think they might stick around for a while?"
Duke's tail wagged a little faster, and Thomas chose to interpret that as optimism. The truth was, he found himself hoping that Elizabeth and Rose would stay longer than just the time it took to repair their wagon. There was something about the young mother's quiet strength and determination that appealed to him, something about the way she had faced whatever difficulties had driven her from Kansas with nothing but a baby and a hen for company. The ranch had felt empty lately, too quiet during the long evenings and too peaceful in ways that sometimes felt more like loneliness than contentment. The arrival of unexpected guests had reminded him how much he enjoyed having people to care for, purposes beyond the daily routines of ranch maintenance and cattle management. As the morning progressed toward noon, Thomas found himself listening for sounds from the guest room, but the house remained peacefully quiet, suggesting that both Elizabeth and Rose were finally getting the rest they so desperately needed. He occupied himself with routine chores, but his attention kept drifting back to Henrietta's ongoing exploration of her new territory. The hen had found his vegetable garden and was systematically working her way through the rows, pecking at insects and weeds with professional efficiency. Thomas had never seen a chicken approach garden maintenance with such systematic thoroughness, and he found himself genuinely impressed by her work ethic. "She's earning her keep already," he murmured to Duke, who was watching Henrietta's activities with obvious interest. "At this rate, she'll have cleaned up my whole garden by evening." The afternoon heat was building, but the ranch house remained cool thanks to its thick adobe walls and strategic placement of windows to catch cross breezes. Thomas found himself wondering what Elizabeth's life had been like in Kansas, what circumstances had driven her to leave everything behind and strike out for California with nothing but the bare necessity. Whatever her story, he was glad that fate or chance or simple mechanical failure had brought her wagon to rest beneath his oak tree. The ranch felt more alive already, more purposeful with the knowledge that people were depending on his hospitality and care. It was a feeling he hadn't realized he'd missed until it returned. 3 weeks had passed since the morning Thomas discovered Elizabeth and Rose beneath the old oak tree, and the Bennett ranch had transformed in ways both subtle and profound. The rhythm of daily life had shifted to accommodate new routines, new voices and new purposes that seemed to breathe fresh energy into every corner of the property. Elizabeth had proven herself invaluable in ways that extended far beyond their original arrangement. Her quick mind and willing hands had tackled problems that Thomas hadn't even realized needed solving. The ranch's account books, neglected since his father's passing, now showed neat columns of figures that actually balanced. The vegetable garden, under her careful tending and Henrietta's enthusiastic pest control, flourished as it hadn't in years. But it was the smaller changes that struck Thomas most deeply. The sound of Rose's laughter echoing from the kitchen where Miss Martinez delighted in entertaining her during meal preparation. The sight of freshly mended curtains fluttering in windows that had been bare for too long. The simple pleasure of having someone to share morning coffee with as they planned the day's work. Henrietta had become something of a local celebrity among the ranch's poultry population. Her daily egg production had indeed shamed Thomas's older hens into renewed productivity, and her systematic approach to garden maintenance had eliminated pest problems that had plagued the vegetables for seasons. She moved about the ranch with the confidence of ownership, leading expeditions to prime foraging spots and establishing herself as the undisputed leader of the chicken hierarchy. Elizabeth had settled into ranch life with a natural grace that suggested she possessed more frontier skills than her initial appearance had revealed. She could milk the stubborn cow that had always given Thomas trouble, coax the temperamental pump to provide steady water flow, and had even successfully treated a mare's infected hoof with remedies she claimed to have learned from her grandmother. Yet despite her growing comfort with ranch routines, Thomas sensed an underlying tension in Elizabeth that never quite disappeared. She would freeze at unexpected sounds, particularly the approach of unfamiliar riders on the main road. Her eyes would scan the horizon with worried intensity whenever she thought no one was watching. And sometimes, late at night, he would hear her pacing in her room, Rose's soft cries suggesting that the baby sensed her mother's unease. The broken wagon wheel had been repaired within the first week, thanks to Jake Henderson's expert craftsmanship and Thomas's insistence on covering the cost. But the wagon remained where they had left it, gathering dust beneath the oak tree while Elizabeth found new reasons each day to postpone their departure. Thomas didn't press the issue,
understanding that her reasons for staying were becoming less about practicality and more about something deep. Mrs. Martinez had taken to Elizabeth like a mother hen with a lost chick, teaching her to prepare traditional New Mexican dishes and sharing stories of her own journey from Mexico decades earlier. The older woman seemed to understand, without need for explanation, that Elizabeth carried wounds that would heal better with time and kindness than with direct questioning. Rose had thrived in the stable environment, her baby laughter becoming a regular soundtrack to ranch activity. She had learned to wave at Thomas when he returned from checking cattle, and her face would light up with recognition whenever Duke approached for his daily dose of baby attention. The child's obvious contentment and healthy development spoke well of her mother's care, even during their most difficult traveling days. Thomas found himself looking forward to meals with an anticipation that had nothing to do with Elizabeth's conversation revealed an educated mind and a dry sense of humor that could transform even routine discussions of ranch business into engaging exchanges. She asked intelligent questions about cattle management and land use, showing genuine interest in understanding the complexities of frontier agriculture. But it was during the quiet evening hours that Thomas treasured most. After Rose was settled for the night and the day's work was complete, he and Elizabeth would sit on the porch, watching the sun paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. Their conversations during these peaceful interludes ranged from practical matters to deeper reflections on life, dreams, and the uncertain nature of the future. Elizabeth proved to be well-read despite her circumstances, able to discuss literature and current events with the kind of insight that came from both education and hard-won experience. She had opinions about women's suffrage, territorial politics, and the changing nature of the American frontier that revealed a mind engaged with the world beyond immediate survival concern. Thomas learned that she had been a schoolteacher in Kansas before her marriage, a profession that explained her obvious intelligence and her natural way with children. She spoke fondly of her students and the one-room schoolhouse where she had taught reading, writing, and arithmetic to children whose educational opportunities might otherwise have been limited. The subject of her marriage remained largely unspoken, though Thomas gathered enough from careful hints and sudden silences to understand that her departure from Kansas had been motivated by circumstances more serious than simple wanderlust. Elizabeth's occasional flinches at unexpected sounds, her automatic positioning of herself between Rose and any strangers, and her persistent checking of windows and doors at night all suggested someone who had learned to be cautious from necessity rather than natural temperament. Thomas respected her privacy while making sure she understood that his ranch offered genuine sanctuary. He had quietly spread word among his neighbors that he was housing guests who valued their privacy, and the local community had responded with the kind of protective discretion that characterized frontier hospitality at its best. Jake Henderson had mentioned seeing strangers asking questions in town about a woman traveling with a baby, but had assured Thomas that no useful information had been shared. Sheriff Morrison had stopped by ostensibly to check on general ranch security, but Thomas understood the visit was really about making sure Elizabeth knew she had official protection if needed. The growing network of quiet support should have been reassuring, but Thomas noticed that news of outside interest in her whereabouts had made Elizabeth more nervous rather than less. She began declining invitations to accompany him on trips to town, preferring to remain at the ranch where she felt more secure. Her reluctance to venture beyond the familiar boundaries of the property suggested that whatever she was avoiding was serious enough to warrant continued caution. Thomas had begun to hope that Elizabeth might consider making the arrangement permanent, though he hadn't yet found the courage to voice such thoughts directly. The ranch felt more complete with her presence, more like the true home he remembered from his childhood when his parents had filled the house with warmth and purpose. Elizabeth's contributions went beyond practical help to encompass something more fundamental about what made a place worth defending and preserving. Rose's presence had awakened paternal instincts in Thomas that he hadn't known he possessed. The baby's trust and affection touched him in ways that were both surprising and deeply satisfying. He found himself thinking about the future differently, imagining the ranch not just as a legacy to maintain, but as a foundation for the next generation to build upon. Miss Martinez had begun making pointed comments about how natural Elizabeth looked in the kitchen, how well she managed household responsibilities, and how obvious it was that Rose thrived under the current arrangement. The older woman's matchmaking tendencies were barely concealed, but Thomas appreciated her support even as he worried about moving too fast or assuming too much about Elizabeth's feelings. The truth was that Thomas had begun to care for Elizabeth in ways that extended far beyond simple hospitality. Her quiet strength appealed to him, as did her obvious devotion to Rose and her willingness to work hard for what she believed in. But he also sensed that she carried emotional burdens that would take time and patience to address, and he was determined not to add pressure to her already difficult situation. Henrietta continued to serve as an unlikely barometer of the ranch's emotional climate. The hen had claimed a permanent nesting spot in the barn, and had begun producing eggs with clockwork regularity. Her proud announcements each morning had become part of the ranch's daily rhythm, and even Thomas's most stubborn hens had begun showing improved productivity under her influence. The red hen had also appointed herself as Rose's unofficial guardian, positioning herself within protective distance whenever the baby was outside. Henrietta's fierce protectiveness extended to warding off any creature that ventured too close to Rose, from wandering chickens to curious ranch cats. Her devotion to the child was both touching and somehow reassuring, as if the hen's instincts confirmed what Thomas already believed about the importance of protecting this small family. One evening in early July, as they sat on the porch watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky, Elizabeth finally began to share more details about her past. The conversation started casually with discussion of Rose's development and her evident happiness in their current surroundings. "She's never known stability like this," Elizabeth said softly, watching her daughter sleep peacefully in the cradle that Thomas had carved during his first week of their stay. "Even before we left Kansas, there was always tension in the house, always the feeling that something was about to go wrong." Thomas waited quietly, understanding that Elizabeth was offering him a glimpse into experiences she rarely discussed. The evening air was warm and still, filled with the gentle sounds of settling livestock and the distant call of night birds. Duke lay at their feet, his presence a comfortable reminder of faithful companionship. "My husband was not a kind man," Elizabeth continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I could change him, or at least find ways to keep the peace. But after Rose was born, his temper got worse instead of better. He saw her as competition for my attention, and he couldn't stand anything that took my focus away from his needs." The simple statement carried implications that made Thomas's hands clench involuntarily. He had suspected domestic violence from various clues, but hearing it confirmed still filled him with protective anger. Elizabeth seemed to sense his reaction, and looked at him with something like gratitude for his obvious concern. "I started planning to leave after he hurt Rose," she said, her voice hardening with remembered determination. "She was only 3 months old, crying because she was hungry, and he grabbed her roughly to make her stop. She had bruises on her tiny arms for weeks." Thomas felt his jaw tighten with barely controlled fury. The idea of anyone harming a defenseless baby, especially one as sweet as Rose, stirred instincts that were both protective and potentially dangerous. Elizabeth must have seen something of his reaction in his expression, because she reached over to touch his arm gently. "That's when I knew I had to get her away from him, no matter what it cost," she continued. "I sold everything I could without him noticing and started making preparations. The hardest part was waiting for the right opportunity, when he would be away long enough for us to get a significant head start." "How did you manage it?" Thomas asked, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. Elizabeth smiled slightly, the first expression of genuine satisfaction he had seen when she discussed her past. "He went to Kansas City on business, bragging about how he would be gone for a full week. I waited until the morning after he left, then loaded what we could carry into the wagon and drove straight out of town. I didn't even stop to say goodbye to neighbors who might have tried to talk me out of it." "And Henriette?" Thomas asked, needing to understand how the practical details had worked. "She was always my favorite of our small flock," Elizabeth explained, her tone warming as she spoke of her feathered companion. "Smart and productive, and somehow understanding that she was special. When I was loading the wagon, she just climbed right in as if she knew she was coming with us. I took it as a sign that I was making the right decision." Thomas nodded, remembering his first impression of the hen's intelligence and dignity. "She chose well," he said simply. "Takes courage to recognize when it's time to leave everything behind." Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, her fingers absently stroking Rose's soft hair as the baby slept. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight of worry that had been building for weeks. "The problem is that Marcus won't just let us go," she said. "He's a proud man with connections throughout Kansas and beyond. Having his wife run away reflects badly on his reputation, and he can't tolerate that kind of public embarrassment." "How do you know he's still looking?" Thomas asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Elizabeth's expression grew troubled. "Before we left Kansas, I heard him tell his brother that if I ever tried to leave him, he would track me down no matter how far I ran. He said he would make sure I never got the chance to embarrass him again." She shivered despite the warm evening air. "Marcus doesn't make threats he doesn't intend to keep." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature, the protective instincts that had been growing stronger each day. Elizabeth and Rose remained at the ranch, now crystallized into something approaching grim determination. Whatever threats Elizabeth faced from her past, they would have to go through him to reach her and Rose. "He won't find you here," Thomas said with quiet certainty. "And even if he does, he won't take you anywhere you don't want to go." Elizabeth turned to look at him directly, searching his face in the dim light. Thomas, you don't understand what kind of man he is. Marcus has money and influence. He knows judges and politicians. If he decides to come for us, he won't come alone, and he won't be concerned about legal niceties. Then he'll discover that New Mexico has its own way of handling men who threaten women and children. Thomas replied. Money and influence don't mean as much out here as they might back in Kansas. What matters is whether a man can be trusted to do right by his neighbors. The conviction in his voice seemed to surprise Elizabeth. She studied his face in the starlight, as if seeing something she hadn't noticed before. You really mean that, don't you? You'd stand up to him even knowing it could bring serious trouble to your ranch. Thomas didn't hesitate. Elizabeth, you and Rose have become part of this place. Part of my family. I don't abandon family when they need protection. The word family hung in the air between them, carrying implications that neither of them had fully acknowledged before. Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears, though whether from gratitude, relief, or something else entirely, Thomas couldn't tell. I never expected to find anything like this, she whispered. When I left Kansas, I was just trying to get far enough away to disappear. I never imagined finding people who would care about what happened to us. You found more than that, Thomas said gently. You found home if you want it. Before Elizabeth could respond to the implicit offer in his words, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Both of them tensed automatically, Elizabeth's hand moving protectively toward Rose's cradle, while Thomas rose from his chair to better assess the potential threat. Duke lifted his head from his resting position, ears alert but not yet showing signs of alarm. The dog's calm demeanor suggested that the approaching riders were familiar, but Elizabeth's obvious anxiety reminded Thomas that any unexpected visitors could represent danger to someone trying to remain hidden. 3 riders emerged from the darkness into the circle of light cast by the porch lantern. Thomas relaxed as he recognized Sheriff Morrison accompanied by 2 men he didn't immediately identify. The sheriff's presence suggested official business rather than a social call, and the late hour indicated urgency of some kind. Evening, Thomas, Sheriff Morrison called as he dismounted. Sorry to disturb you so late, but we need to have a word. His eyes moved to Elizabeth with an expression that might have been sympathy or concern. Elizabeth had gone pale in the lamplight, her hand gripping Rose's cradle so tightly her knuckles showed white. Thomas moved closer to her chair, positioning himself between his guests and the approaching men in a gesture that was both protective and subtly territorial. What can I do for you, Sheriff? Thomas asked, keeping his voice level despite the tension he could feel radiating from Elizabeth. Sheriff Morrison glanced at his companions before answering. These gentlemen have come from Kansas with some questions about a missing woman and child. Thought you might be able to help them with their inquiry. One of the strangers stepped forward, and Thomas immediately disliked everything about the man's appearance and demeanor. Well dressed in expensive clothing that looked out of place in the frontier setting, he carried himself with the arrogant confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way through money and intimidation rather than personal merit. Miss Bennett, the stranger said, his tone carrying false courtesy that didn't mask underlying threat. My name is Marcus Walsh. I'm looking for my wife Elizabeth and our daughter Rose. I have reason to believe they may have passed through your area. Thomas felt Elizabeth's sharp intake of breath behind him, heard the barely audible whimper of fear that she couldn't quite suppress. Rose stirred in her cradle, responding to her mother's distress with the sensitivity that babies often showed to emotional tension.
Can't say I've seen anyone matching that description, Thomas replied calmly, though every instinct screamed warnings about the man standing before him. Marcus Walsh radiated the kind of controlled violence that Thomas had learned to recognize in dangerous animals, the barely contained aggression of a predator temporarily constrained by circumstances. Marcus's smile was cold and calculating. That's interesting, Mr. Bennett, because I have reliable information suggesting otherwise. My wife is not well, you understand. She's been suffering from nervous conditions since our daughter's birth, and I'm very concerned about their safety. The lies came so smoothly that Thomas might have believed them if he hadn't spent weeks observing Elizabeth's obvious competence and mental stability. Marcus was clearly practiced at manipulating situations to his advantage, probably using claims of his wife's mental instability to justify whatever actions he deemed necessary. I'm sorry I can't help you, Thomas said firmly. If I had seen a woman and baby in distress, I certainly would have rendered assistance and made sure the proper authorities were notified. Sheriff Morrison shifted uncomfortably, clearly caught between his duty to assist in legitimate searches for missing persons and his instincts about the true nature of the situation. Thomas caught the sheriff's eye and tried to convey without words that the official story was not the complete truth. Marcus's expression hardened slightly, though he maintained his facade of concerned husband. Miss Bennett, I hope you understand that harboring a mentally unstable woman and an infant could put them in serious danger. If you have any information about their whereabouts, it would be in everyone's best interest to share it. The veiled threat was unmistakable, though delivered with the kind of careful phrasing that maintained plausible deniability. Thomas felt his own temper beginning to rise but forced himself to remain calm and apparently cooperative. "I appreciate your concern for your family," Thomas replied evenly. "If I encounter anyone who needs help, I'll be sure to contact the proper authorities immediately." Behind him, Thomas could hear Elizabeth's breathing becoming rapid and shallow, the kind of panic response that suggested she was reliving traumatic memories. Rose began to cry softly, picking up on her mother's distress in the way that infants often did. Marcus's eyes shifted toward the sound of the crying baby, and Thomas saw recognition flicker across his features. The man's entire demeanor changed subtly, becoming more focused and predatory as he realized he had found what he was looking for. "That sounds like a young child," Marcus observed with false casualness. "I hope whoever's caring for the baby understands the importance of proper medical attention for infants, especially if the mother isn't capable of making sound decisions about child care." Thomas felt Elizabeth trembling behind him and made a decision that would change everything. Whatever happened next, he was committed to protecting the woman and child who had found sanctuary on his land. Marcus Walsh would not take them back to Kansas, no matter what legal or financial resources he might possess. "Sheriff," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of steel that suggested immovable determination, "I think these gentlemen should continue their search elsewhere. As I've told them, I have no information that would help them locate missing persons." Sheriff Morrison studied Thomas's face for a long moment, clearly reading the subtext of the situation. The sheriff was a good man who understood the difference between legal technicalities and moral obligations, and Thomas hoped he would choose to support what was right rather than what was merely convenient. "Well, gentlemen," Sheriff Morrison said finally, "it seems like Mr. Bennett has been as helpful as he can be. Perhaps we should continue our inquiries in town tomorrow." Marcus's mask of civility slipped slightly, revealing the anger beneath. "Sheriff, I hope you understand that I have legal rights as a husband and father. If someone is interfering with my attempts to recover my family, I understand the law quite well, Mr. Walsh." Sheriff Morrison interrupted firmly. "I also understand that making accusations without evidence isn't helpful to anyone. If you have specific information about criminal activity, we can discuss it at my office during regular business hours." The sheriff's tone carried a clear warning that further pressure would not be welcome. Marcus seemed to recognize that he had pushed as hard as the situation would allow, at least for the moment. "Of course, Sheriff," Marcus said, his voice tight with suppressed fury. "I'm sure we can resolve this matter through proper channels." His eyes fixed on Thomas with unmistakable menace. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Bennett. I'm sure we'll have occasion to speak again soon." As the three men remounted their horses and rode back into the darkness, Thomas remained standing at the edge of the porch until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely. Only then did he turn back to Elizabeth, who was holding Rose against her chest while tears streamed down her face. "He found us," she whispered, her voice breaking with despair. "I thought we were far enough away, hidden well enough, but he found us anyway." Thomas knelt beside her chair, his large hands gently covering her trembling ones. "Elizabeth, listen to me. Finding you and taking you are two very different things. He may know where you are, but that doesn't mean he can force you to go back with him." Elizabeth shook her head desperately. "You don't understand what he's capable of. Marcus doesn't care about legal niceties when he wants something. He'll find a way to take Rose and use her to force me to comply." The fear in her voice was raw and immediate, born from intimate knowledge of her husband's ruthlessness. Thomas felt his protective instincts crystallizing into something approaching dangerous fury, but he forced himself to focus on reassurance rather than revenge. "He'll have to go through me to get to either of you," Thomas said with quiet certainty. "And I promise you, Elizabeth, that's not going to happen." Elizabeth looked into his eyes, searching for doubt or uncertainty, and finding only rock-solid determination. For the first time since the riders had appeared, her breathing began to slow toward normal, as she absorbed the reality of his commitment to protecting her and Rose. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you risk everything for people you've only known for a few weeks?" Thomas's answer came without hesitation, carrying the weight of absolute truth. "Because some things are worth fighting for, and you and Rose are at the top of that list." Outside, Henrietta's voice rang out across the ranch yard in a series of agitated clucks that suggested the hen had also sensed danger. Even in the darkness, Thomas could see her moving restlessly around the chicken coop, her protective instincts aroused by the presence of threats to her adopted family. The battle lines had been drawn, though the full conflict was yet to come. Dawn broke gray and ominous over the Bennett ranch, the sky heavy with storm clouds that matched the tension hanging over the household. Thomas had spent most of the night patrolling the property with Duke at his side, while Elizabeth paced the kitchen with Rose, both mother and child too unsettled to find rest. Marcus had made his move just after sunrise, arriving with a territorial judge and 2 armed deputies. The legal papers he carried declared Elizabeth mentally incompetent,
and granted him custody of Rose pending her return to Kansas for proper medical evaluation. The documents looked official enough to fool most people, bearing impressive seals and signatures that spoke of money changing hands in the right places. "This is entirely legal, Mr. Bennett," Judge Crawford announced, his pompous tone suggesting a man who enjoyed wielding power over others. "Miss Walsh is coming home with her husband where she belongs, and their child will receive proper care." Thomas stood on his porch, rifle resting casually in the crook of his arm, blocking access to the house where Elizabeth waited with trembling hands. Miss Martinez had positioned herself at the kitchen window with her own shotgun, her weathered face set in lines of fierce determination that would have impressed Apache warrior. "Seems to me like the lady ought to have some say in the matter," Thomas replied calmly, though his knuckles were white where they gripped the rifle stock. "Last I checked, this was still America, where folks get to choose their own." Marcus stepped forward with the confident swagger of a man accustomed to getting his way through intimidation and legal manipulation. "My wife is ill, Mr. Bennett. She's not capable of making rational decisions about her own welfare or our daughter's care." Elizabeth appeared in the doorway behind Thomas, Rose clutched protectively against her chest. Her voice rang clear and strong across the yard, carrying no trace of the mental instability Marcus claimed. "I am perfectly capable of speaking for myself, and I choose to remain here with people who treat me with kindness and respect. You see," Marcus addressed the judge with theatrical concern, "she's clearly delusional. She's abandoned her home, her duties as a wife, and dragged our infant daughter across dangerous territory based on imaginary grievances." Judge Crawford nodded sagely, playing his purchased role to perfection. "Indeed, quite concerning. Mrs. Walsh, you'll come along quietly now. This gentleman has provided suitable transportation back to Kansas, where you can receive proper medical attention." Thomas took a step forward, his intention unmistakable. "She's not going anywhere she doesn't want to go, and that baby stays with her mother, where she belongs." One of the deputies moved his hand toward his sidearm, but froze when he realized that Thomas wasn't the only armed person present. Jake Henderson had arrived with 3 of his sons, all carrying rifles and wearing expressions that suggested they'd be happy to use them. Sheriff Morrison sat his horse at the edge of the group, his face troubled but his hand resting meaningfully on his gun belt. "Now see here," Judge Crawford blustered, clearly uncomfortable with the show of local resistance to his authority. "I'll have you all arrested for interfering with lawful proceedings." "Your Honor," Sheriff Morrison spoke up quietly, "I've been doing some checking on those papers you're carrying. Seems like they were issued mighty fast, and by a judge who doesn't usually handle family matters." Marcus's face flushed with anger as his carefully constructed legal facade began to crumble. "Sheriff, I hope you're not suggesting that properly issued court documents should be ignored based on your personal opinions. I'm suggesting that Miss Walsh deserves a fair hearing before an impartial judge, not a kangaroo court proceeding designed to railroad her back into a situation she fled for good reason." Morrison replied firmly. Elizabeth stepped fully onto the porch, her fear transformed into righteous anger. "Marcus, I will never return to Kansas with you. I will never again allow you to hurt me or threaten my daughter. Find yourself another victim, because I am done being yours." The declaration hung in the morning air like a challenge, and Marcus's mask of civilized concern finally slipped completely. "You belong to me, Elizabeth. You and the child both. No frontier, nobody is going to keep me from taking what's mine." Thomas's rifle came up smoothly, the barrel pointed directly at Marcus's chest. "Mister, you just made a serious mistake. Nobody belongs to anybody else, and nobody threatens women and children on my land." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, with armed men on both sides waiting for someone to make the first move. Rose began crying in Elizabeth's arms, her infant distress cutting through the tension like a knife. It was Henrietta who broke the moment, appearing from nowhere to position herself between the opposing groups with ruffled feathers and fierce determination. The red hen's proud defiance in the face of overwhelming odds seemed to shame the human participants into remembering their better nature. Judge Crawford cleared his throat nervously, suddenly eager to distance himself from a situation that had turned dangerous. "Perhaps we should reconsider this matter through proper legal channels," he suggested weakly. "Violence benefits no one, and there may be procedural questions that need addressing." Marcus realized his carefully planned intimidation had failed spectacularly. Faced with determined local opposition, and the collapse of his legal pretenses, he fell back on the threats that had always worked before. "This isn't over, Elizabeth," he snarled. "I'll be back with proper authority, and next time these farmers won't be able to protect you. Next time you show up here making threats, you'll find out what New Mexico hospitality really looks like." Thomas replied evenly, "And I promise you won't enjoy the experience." As the defeated party retreated, Elizabeth collapsed into Thomas's arms, overwhelmed by relief and the realization that she had finally found people willing to fight for her freedom. Rose's cries softened to whimpers as her mother's tension eased, and Henrietta strutted proudly around the porch as if she had personally routed the invader. 2 months later, The crisis had passed into memory, replaced by the quiet contentment of people who had found their proper places in the world. Elizabeth's divorce had been finalized by a fair-minded judge in Santa Fe, and Marcus's attempts at legal harassment had been thwarted by Sheriff Morrison's careful documentation of his intimidation tactics. The ranch had settled into new rhythms that felt as natural as breathing. Elizabeth managed the household accounts and correspondence with the efficiency of her teaching background, while Rose grew plump and happy under the doting attention of her extended frontier family. Henrietta ruled the chicken coop with benevolent authority, her daily egg production a source of pride and prosperity. Thomas found himself planning for the future in ways he hadn't dared imagine before Elizabeth's arrival. The old ranch house echoed with laughter and purpose, filled with the voices of people who had chosen to build something together rather than merely endure in isolation. On a golden October evening, as they sat on the porch watching Rose take her first wobbling steps across the weathered boards, Thomas finally found the courage to voice what had been growing in his heart since that first morning beneath the oak tree. "Elizabeth," he said quietly, "I've been thinking about permanence, about making this arrangement official in all the ways that matter." She looked at him with eyes that held no more fear, only the warm certainty of a woman who had found her true home. "Are you proposing to me, Thomas Bennett?" "I am indeed," he replied, pulling a simple gold band from his pocket. "Will you marry me, Elizabeth Walsh? Will you stay here and help me build something worth passing on to the next generation?" Her answer came in the form of a kiss that tasted like hope and new beginnings, while Rose clapped her tiny hands in delight and Henrietta announced the engagement with a triumphant crow that echoed across the peaceful ranch. 6 months later, the small church in town witnessed a wedding that brought together the entire community in celebration of love conquering adversity. Elizabeth walked down the aisle in a dress of white silk that Miss Martinez had sewn with painstaking care, while Rose toddled behind carrying a basket of flower petals with serious concentration. Thomas waited at the altar in his best suit, Duke sitting proudly at his side wearing a collar of braided leather that Elizabeth had crafted specially for the occasion. Even Henrietta attended, perched regally on the windowsill, and surveying the proceedings with obvious approval, as they exchanged vows promising to love and protect each other through whatever challenges the future might bring. Elizabeth felt the last of her old fears dissolve completely. She had traveled far from the frightened woman who once slept in a broken wagon with nothing but a baby and a hen for company. The ranch prospered under their joint management, becoming known throughout the territory as a place where travelers could find fair dealing and genuine hospitality. Rose grew into a spirited child who could ride before she could properly walk, equally at home chasing chickens or helping her father mend fences. Henrietta lived to a remarkable old age for a hen, presiding over multiple generations of poultry with the wisdom and dignity befitting the matriarch who had helped transform a desperate flight into a love story. Her descendants continued her tradition of exceptional egg production, ensuring that the Bennett Ranch remained famous for the quality of its breakfast offering. Years later, when Rose had children of her own and the ranch had expanded into one of the most successful operations in New Mexico, Elizabeth would sometimes sit beneath the old oak tree and remember that desperate morning when Thomas had offered sanctuary to strangers. The broken wagon had long since been repaired and put to useful service, but it remained a symbol of how the worst circumstances could lead to the best outcomes when met with courage and kindness. Thomas would join her there as evening painted the sky in familiar shades of gold and purple, their grown daughter's laughter echoing from the house where the next generation was learning the values that made life worth living. In those peaceful moments, surrounded by the evidence of dreams fulfilled and love rewarded, they knew they had built something that would endure long after they were gone. The ranch that had sheltered a frightened woman and her baby had become a legacy of hope, proving that sometimes the most important journeys begin with the simple words, "Stay, if she lays dinner." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.